as dark forces breed in the east under the watchful eye of an ethereal tyrant. Wraiths and spectres patrol the earth in search of an enchanted ring that will bring an end to the age of men. There is only a single way to impede the march of evil, and it is to journey east and destroy the ring in the fires that fuel the villain's soul itself. And happily, the heroes are in possession of that ring. This is the premise of John Reynolds Raoul Tolkien's fantasy, The Lord of the Rings. And as the innocent residents of what he calls Middle Earth face the prospect of enslavement or worse at the hands of a merciless fiend, a cast of mythic figures gather to form a fellowship and destroy the ring. And one of the more tense moments of the first book or movie is when men, elves, dwarfs, and a wizard deliberate over who should hold the ring of power during the journey. Who possess the traits that will best insulate them from temptation to keep it and motivate them to stay the course and destroy it. Elves possessed keen vision and equanimity. Men possessed daring and ingenuity. Dwarves had tenacity and brawn, and the wizard, in addition to magic, had erudition and intuition. And beyond these figures sat four hobbits, a race of human-like creatures who are smaller than dwarfs and live simply in the hills, spending their time enjoying food, drink, and each other's company. And as the elves and men and dwarves debate their respective strengths and deny each other's claims to carry and curate the ring, it is a hobbit that steps forward and earns their trust, receiving the support and endorsement of the wise wizard. And though this whole tale may sound rather quaint and more than a little detached from real life, Tolkien wrote his fantasy in the wake of two world wars, and much of the landscape and the plot of his tale was inspired by the conflicts that defined Europe and the world for decades. And the theme of good against evil was confronted anew by him with an analysis of what kind of heroism is required to defeat malice, to complete a task with stakes that shake the foundations of the moral imagination. And for Tolkien, it was the quiet, ordinary heroism of hobbits. And this morning we read the beginning of a very different tale, one that inaugurated our history with the selection of our first hero. Avram is summoned by God to depart Mesopotamia for an unknown destination in a bid to break away from the moon worship and human indignities that defined much of the ancient Near Eastern culture. Lech Lecha, he is told, go forth, me'artzecha, from your land, from your birthplace, from your father's home, ela aretz asher ar'eka, to the land that I will show you. But what we are not told at this significant juncture, in this, the moment that a man is chosen to become the most influential person in human history, we're not told why he was chosen. In the words of the Ramban, Nachmanides, Zot ha-parasha lo be'era kol ha'inyan, this passage doesn't explain the narrative arc, ma ta'am she'omar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, giving the reason that God spoke to him in particular. Moshe, before we're told of him being selected as liberator, leaves a trail of heroic choices to save a slave and stop a fight and censure misogyny. Noah, whose life comes to a rather ignominious end, is introduced before he's designated as the progenitor of humanity, as a righteous man, as an ish tzaddik, perfect in his age. So why, as we turn a new page and God picks a man to pave the way to escape the demoralizing fetters of idolatrous myth, does he select Avraham? What about him made him the best candidate for the task? What did he stand for and made him stand out from the vast array of contenders for the part which trait or feature made him the only obvious choice? That is my question. And for a whole array of our commentators, the answer is as clear as day. God didn't choose Avraham. Avraham chose God. For Maimonides, our forefather was the first true philosopher who, reflecting upon physics and meditating on metaphysics, came to see nature as evidence of God. In his words, V'libo mishotet, his heart meandered umevin, and he mused ad sheyasik derech haemet, until he grasped the truth. V'yada, and knew sheyesh Shem Elokai Echad, that there is a single God. So for the Rambam, it was Avraham's philosophical acumen, cerebral aptitude, and logical lucidity that led him to find God, and in turn led God to address him. For others, it wasn't Avraham's philosophical sophistication, but his theological conviction, his principled faith, that identified him as worthy. In the telling of one midrash, one with which many will already be familiar, Avram was an iconoclast, the son of an idol maker who broke his father's merchandise, stoked political unrest, and faced a king's rage and the flames in the name of God. And for both of these readings, Avram was perhaps stunned but not surprised to hear the word of God, the supreme being that he discovered and was willing to fight and die for. He was prepared for the call. In the words of the Sfat Emet, Muchan lekabel ha'ma'amar, he was prepared for the call. But there is another reading that sees Avraham as taken by surprise when he hears a summons to leave his land and family. A reading that sees Avraham as chosen not because he had discovered God himself or exhibited the conviction of his faith, but for something far less ostensibly heroic that we are in fact told about before the call comes. Because this morning is not the first time that we meet Avram. Right at the end of last week's parsha, in the wake of the dispersion of the builders of Babel, we are introduced to Noah's great, 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 great grandson, Terach, Abraham's father. And the details of the family are incredibly sketchy. We're told that Terach had three sons, that one of them passed away, and that the remaining two, Avram and Nachor, married the daughters of their deceased brother to perpetuate his memory. But then we are told nothing about Nachor and his wife Milcah, but there is a lone sentence, a single verse, unprovoked, unrelated, and ostensibly extraneous, that reveals something about Avraham's wife, Sarah, or Sarai. Vatihi Sarai akara. Sarah was barren. Ein la vlad. She had no child. And while, of course, this verse invites us to consider Sarai's condition, it also tells us a key fact about Avraham too, that in a time in which women were often instrumentalized simply as a means for breeding children, Avraham was committed to Sarai herself far more deeply. Despite their not having children, Avram stays by her side and refuses to remarry or abandon her until she herself insists upon it. And perhaps it is this fact that explains God's choice of Avram. Perhaps at this stage, Avram was not a theologian or an iconoclast. Perhaps he wasn't a revolutionary or a logician, or if he was, that these were far less relevant to his summons to sire our nation. What God saw in him, the only thing that the text tells us that God saw in him, was a devotion to his wife, despite trying circumstances. Despite no prospect of children in their advancing years, Avraham remains constant in his affections and steadfast in his support of Sarai. So perhaps when God surveyed the contenders to father a nation that would know pain and impediments and recurrent suspended redemptions, he did not look for brawn or nerve or acuity or even belief, but a spirit of deep devotion to those with whom one has built a bond and given their word, even when the world closes in on them. So perhaps not too unlike Tolkien's fantastical reflections on the kind of heroism that doesn't simply win wars but stays the course, God sees in Avram what we might have overlooked or consider a pedestrian trait, one that will keep a people's faith strong through a history filled with hurdles. God saw his devotion to another. So as we, the heirs of Avram, aspire to live out his legacy and live up to his example, let us deepen our devotion to each other and even to our own dreams. Let us find the strength to transcend impediments and surmount obstacles that hamper our growth, knowing that it is our fidelity to our dreams, our devotion to each other, and our commitment to our common cause that all those years ago marked a man as worthy and drew a voice from heaven. I wish you a Shavua Tov.